Americans are shaped by biases, stereotypes, and the history of racism in this country that incline us to treat certain groups of people in certain ways. As a young white male from a middle-class family in rural America, I found it difficult to relate to the arguments made in Eddie S. Glaude's Democracy in Black. The following book review is meant for the young conservative reader. However, I'd like to make it known that all groups of people are more than welcome to view and enjoy this book review. In principle, I agree with Eddie S. Glaude Jr. that there is a value gap that plagues this great nation. However, I would still not recommend this book to the young conservative reader due to Glaude's sometimes faulty reliance on equity versus equality, his sparse use of hasty generalizations, and his tendency to, on occasion, use divisive rhetoric. But before we delve further into this book review, let me define for you what I mean when I say conservative. In a broader sense, to paraphrase Paul Ryan, I mean those who believe in the American idea. They believe in lower taxes, welfare reform, gender and racial equality, school choice, smaller government, and pro-growth policies. In order for you to truly understand the content of this video book review, let me first begin by giving you a brief summary of the content of this book. For the sake of simplicity, I believe that this book can be broken down into three main parts. The first of which is that of the value gap and its perpetuation. On page 31, Glaude defines the value gap as the differences between the values and principles that Americans have on display and their valuation of white lives against those of other races. Later, he goes on to say that this value gap is perpetuated by two things. The first being explicit and implicit acts of racism that occur on a daily basis, and the second being that of white fear, which is the very possibility of black crime that poses a threat to the way of life of whites. This, on page 76, Glaude argues, perpetuates the value gap by shaping public sentiment and informing public policy debate. The second main part of Glaude's book is that of complacency, which is the road to division. First, Glaude describes how too many white and black Americans were complacent with the state of the civil rights movement after the Martin Luther King era. Furthermore, he describes how differing sentiment with the state of the civil rights movement has led to three sects within the Black Liberal Party. Those being, one, traditional black liberals, who believe that there is a difference between our values and our practices. Two, conservative black liberals, who firmly believe in black self-reliance. And three, post-black liberals, who acknowledge race only to point to the need to go beyond it. Glaude also blames much of America for the stagnation of the civil rights movement due to their complacency with President Obama as a symbol of black progress, although he was not a voice for its people. In the last main piece of Democracy in Black, Glaude outlines the way forward. He discusses how division within the Liberal Party has led to a departure from previous civil rights leaders such as Al Sharpton and a transfer of power to a new, younger grassroots leadership. A grassroots leadership that believes in an in-the-moment activism, which can lead to bloodless revolutions and demonstrations that demand a change in regressive politics. The goal of the way forward is to not let anyone be comfortable until the value gap is no more. Now that you have a more thorough understanding of Eddie S. Glaude Jr.'s Democracy in Black, let us discuss the implications that it has for the young conservative reader. The first reason that I would not recommend this book to a young conservative audience is that I do not want them to misunderstand the difference between equality and equity. In this day and age, young people are bombarded with political propaganda and misinformation. It is when sifting through this information that it is of the utmost importance to understand basic terminology to be able to avoid making hasty generalizations. This ability allows for them to be better citizens and stewards of society. And lastly, understanding basic terminology and the differences between equity and equality can help a young conservative audience defend themselves from the sometimes hasty generalizations made in society that sometimes equate the word conservative to that of racist. As I stress the definitions of equity and equality, let me first give you the definitions as they are apparent to me. Equality means that regardless of race, class, or gender, all people are treated in the same way. Thus, all people have the same rights and responsibilities. On the other hand, equity takes into account differences of background and treats people in different ways in order to ensure the sameness of outcome. In other words, equality is where you start and equity is where you end up. Keep these definitions in mind as we move forward. On page 108, Glaude quotes Martin Luther King Jr. in saying that all Americans should be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He goes on to say that conservatives believed that this meant that it was the individual that mattered and not the history of the groups. This concept is what Glaude alludes to as colorblindness. The colorblindness that he describes ensures that every person has the same rights and responsibilities, regardless of racial background. This is racial equality. However, racial inequity is still present due to colorblindness because there is no assurance of equal outcomes. Glaude demonstrates this point in his first chapter titled The Great Black Depression. In this chapter, Glaude shows the comparative impact that the housing market crash had on blacks as opposed to whites. He shows that African Americans lost more homes, jobs, and liquidity than did white Americans due to a value gap that he says was perpetuated by racial inequality. However, I believe that in this scenario, Glaude confused the definitions of equality and equity. You see, racial equity would have ensured the sameness of outcomes for all races after the housing market crashed in 2008. However, racial equality still allows for the value gap to persist because it does not consider racial backgrounds. The differences in socioeconomic status caused by racial inequity resulted in the differences in the amount of homes and jobs lost between black and white Americans in 2008. On page 34, Glaude helps to prove my point when he says, referring to the government, that they may provide a framework for equality, but the value gap will always find a way to rig the outcome. With this, I completely agree. There may be equal opportunity, however, differences in value will perpetuate racial inequity. In fact, had Glaude tried to assert initially that racial inequity were the cause of the Great Black Depression, economically it would have made perfect sense. It's because African Americans were not emancipated until later in history that they were not allowed to start the race up the social caste ladder as soon as were white Americans, thus the gap in equity. However, as we continue in this country to provide for equal opportunity, we will begin to see this gap in equity shrink. In fact, we see this trend today as NPR reports African American unemployment at an all-time low of 4.9%. The second reason that I would not recommend this book to the young conservative reader is that there are a few instances where Glaude utilizes some logical fallacies. The fallacies are made in regard to conservative figures and ideals. However, they may be unintentionally placed, as the presumed audience of this book is liberals who may understand the arguments and points that Glaude is trying to make through his writing. First, Glaude denounces Bill O'Reilly and other conservatives for believing that what is wrong with the Black community is not racism, but instead the breakdown of the family, the absence of fathers, and the failure to embrace education. In this instance, Glaude does not acknowledge the possible counterargument put forth by its data. Instead, he dismisses it as false justifications. On page 43, Glaude goes on to say, "To my mind, this does not mean all Americans are mean-spirited people who lack empathy for the less fortunate, although the likes of Paul Ryan and Ted Cruz may make me change my mind." Without allowing for an examination of the actions of these two conservatives, Glaude alludes to the fact that these two men are mean-spirited people who lack empathy for the less fortunate. This generalization of character without supporting evidence may be a hasty generalization. Although I do believe that young conservatives should be presented with the opposing argument in order to better understand their own views, I believe that being presented with arguments that contain hasty generalizations that lack crucial supporting evidence has the potential to damage what they view as a reputable argument. In efforts to acknowledge both sides of the matter, I will say that many may feel Eddie S. Glaude Jr.'s Democracy in Black is perfectly suited for the likes of those who deem themselves to be conservative. The value gap has been permitted to exist in this country for many years under the guise of this nation's historical narrative. A narrative that's been written by predominantly white men. Thus, it is perhaps fair to say African Americans may have been deprived of the history that they rightfully deserve. African American students have been forced to accept this narrative. Some may argue it is time that those in charge of writing the narrative examine the other side of history, the historical narrative through the eyes of those who have been systematically oppressed. Yet still, while acknowledging the other side, I remain steadfast in my belief to not recommend this book to the young conservative, due to Glaude choosing to omit what I believe to be a key historical figure. Although the value gap does make itself evident throughout the American historical narrative, I don't believe that this permits Glaude to create his own narrative. Two wrongs do not effectively make a right. Thus, any written account of history should be written as objectively as possible. Throughout his book, Glaude ensures to cite many famous civil rights leaders, including, but not limited to, Reverend Jackson, Martin Luther King Jr., and W.E.B. Du Bois. However, he omits the rhetoric of a particularly interesting civil rights activist from the early 1900s, Booker T. Washington. Perhaps the following quote from Washington will shed some insight as to why. Washington said, "There is a class of colored people who make a business of keeping the troubles, the wrongs, and the hardships of the Negro race before the public. Some of these people do not want the Negro to lose his grievances because they do not want to lose their jobs. There's a certain class of race problem solvers who do not want the patient to get well." I believe that Booker T. Washington's views were omitted from Glaude's book because Washington believed that America was a melting pot, a mixing of cultures per se. PBS reported that Booker T. Washington believed in self-help and accommodation. Contrarily, Glaude believes that if the Negro identity were to be viewed in the same light as Italian, German, or French ancestry, that would be a cession of power to white people. This view leads to separatist rhetoric, as seen on page 167, when Glaude speaks about the negative effects of racial transcendence as proposed by post-black liberals. Glaude states, "Either you're black or you're blank." This quote seems to assert that those who do not embrace their heritage are both culturally and socially inept. It also asserts that African Americans must continue to see the differences between themselves and other races. Also, on page 219, in the chapter titled Resurrection, Glaude fondly recalls an event from the Ferguson protests where a young man is screaming over a bullhorn, "Fuck the police." This continues to act as divisive rhetoric, as it does nothing to repair the mistrust between some members of the African American community and some members of law enforcement. Lastly, Glaude's view that there is a need for separate African American community centers, churches, and colleges presents what I believe to be a view of separatism. All of these examples show that Eddie S. Glaude Jr. does not believe that America is a melting pot of cultures. Instead, he believes that America is a separate mosaic. In the end, I am a firm believer in freedom and equality for all Americans. However, I would not recommend Eddie S. Glaude Jr.'s Democracy in Black for a young conservative audience, because I believe that he prescribes a solution of separatism to achieve racial equity, not racial equality. Thank you for your time, and thank you for watching.